Welcome to Flaxborough, where a coffin won't close and a mirror starts whispering back. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me, have you checked your reflection lately? It was generally accepted in Flaxborough that death, when it occurred, ought to behave itself. One could expire by all means, and with due ceremony be conveyed to St. Cuthbert's for interim housing. One could be wept for mildly and discussed thoroughly. But the dead were expected, as a matter of civic decorum, to present no further inconvenience. Certainly not after the sandwiches. Thus it was something of an aberration, mild but persistent, when the coffin of Mrs Edna Polliver refused to close. It had started, as these things do, innocently enough. Mrs Polliver, late of 14 Heather Bell Crescent, had been one of those women who, in life, wore felt slippers year-round and considered other people's children a municipal failing. Her demise, occasioned by a coronary event somewhere between the biscuit tin and the gas fire, was not unexpected. Nor was it particularly mourned outside a radius of 2 houses in either direction. The Undertakers, Messrs Codd and Strang, had laid her out with moderate reverence and some relief. Her funeral, a Wednesday affair, Wednesdays being cheapest for floral arrangements, was scheduled for 2 o'clock sharp. There was a light drizzle, which was felt to be fitting, but when the pallbearers, supervised by the junior Mr Codd, attempted to lower the lid before the service, it met with resistance, not in a violent or mechanical sense. No spring shot out, no hinge buckled. It simply refused to sit flush, the top rising by nearly half an inch, no matter how discreetly pressure was applied. The phenomenon was inspected. First by young Mr Codd, whose professional concern veiled a rising blush. Then by Mrs Constance Thrip, churchwarden and habitual supplier of lemon-barley water to the bereaved. Then by the vicar, who was fetched from the vestry and approached the situation with a sigh that suggested he suspected modern plumbing. Even a passer-by, a Mr Rawle of the Town Planning Subcommittee, who had misread the posted notice and believed the service to be for someone he disliked, was roped in to peer over the coffin with the grave tact of a man checking a radiator. Each declared it peculiar, and each importantly declared it best not to fuss just now. Eventually, a small velvet cushion, taken from the floral stand and divested of its ribbon that read Auntie, was inserted between the lid and the latch to disguise the irregularity. The funeral proceeded. Psalms were murmured. Soil was cast. Mrs Polliver, who had not been known for her flexibility in life, was laid to rest with a modest yet undeniable incline to her person. It was only 2 days later, in the cool and orderly office of Inspector Purbright, that the matter was raised again. Not by Codd and Strang, who had quietly added a surcharge for lid adjustment, nor by the vicar, who had since resumed his minor war with the bell-ringing rota. No, it was the gravedigger, a man called Albert Winstanley, stooped, bewhiskered, and possessed of an unexpectedly poetic turn, who arrived, hat in hand and voice lowered, to suggest that perhaps Mrs Polliver's coffin had not been empty of incident after all. "I'd not have said a word," Winstanley murmured, eyeing the edges of Purbright's blotter with reverence, "if it weren't for the whispering." Purbright, who was at that moment unhurriedly applying blotting paper to a report on stolen step-ladders, looked up mildly. "Whispering, Mr Winstanley?" "Aye, but not in the way you'd think. Not, ghostly, just muffled. Like someone under a good deal of upholstery, and—" He glanced over his shoulder. "There was something sharp, sir. Bit of metal poking through the lining. I only saw it because the hem'd come undone where the wood wouldn't close proper." Purbright nodded, as though he'd been waiting for someone to say this all week. "I see. And you didn't mention it on the day?" Winstanley looked affronted. "Not at a burial, sir. Would have been rude." "Quite." The inspector made a neat note in his pad. Just one line, written slowly. Coffin lid, resistance unexplained. Sound, muffled. Metal, present. He looked up, pleasant and unfazed. "I think, Mr. Winstanley, we might take a short walk together." Outside, Flaxborough buzzed with its usual inconsequence, shop fronts being wiped down, minor arguments about wheelie bin placement, the newspaper shop offering 2 for 1 on barley sugar. The cemetery, with its modest hedgerows and opportunistic pigeons, awaited them at the edge of the town. And so began, under skies as grey as official paper, the inquiry into the matter of the coffin that wouldn't close. It would, as Purbright quietly suspected, turn out to have very little to do with the dead at all. Inspector Purbright walked with a gait neither quick nor slow, the sort of pace that suggested punctuality to no particular appointment. Beside him, Albert Winstanley's steps were shorter, occasionally stumbling on gravel disturbed by mole activity, an affliction the Flaxborough Parks Committee had discussed at 6 separate meetings without resolution. They turned into the iron-gated entrance of St. Cuthbert's Cemetery, where the path split decorously between the older headstones, those with moss, tilts, and hyphenated names, and the newer, flatter plots favoured by cost-conscious mourners and efficient groundskeeping. The wind fussed gently with the laurel branches. Somewhere in the distance, a bell was ringing a half-hearted 1/4 something. "This way, sir," Winstanley said, adjusting his cap, which had failed to shield his ears from pinking. Purbright followed him to the 3rd row from the path, where a modest mound of earth still bore the scalloped rake marks of post-funeral smoothing. The headstone had not yet been erected, though a laminated name marker, speared upright into the soil, informed the passing beetles that this was Edna Polliver, born 1922, Daftours 1976, at rest. The rest, it appeared, had been only partially achieved. "She's down there," said Winstanley, as if that detail might otherwise have been overlooked. "Wednesday, 2:30. We'd done the lowering, went like a dream, and I was just about to cover when I heard it. Whispery. Then it stopped. Just that once." Purbright nodded, crouched and examined the earth. Not as a forensic man might. There was no brushing away of grains with tweezers, but with the calm, faintly speculative interest of a man assessing the merit of a lemon tart at the Women's Institute stall. His eyes settled on a shallow indentation near the foot of the grave. A heel mark, perhaps. Not fresh, not purposeful either. He stood. "This was the only sound?" he asked. Winstanley pursed his lips. "Nothing more I could swear to, sir, but I'll say this. I've lowered a good many ladies into the ground, and none of them left metal showing." Purbright raised a brow ever so slightly. "You mean?" Winstanley pointed vaguely to the spot beneath the foot of the coffin. "There was a little jag, sharp-like. Caught the light when we lowered her. Looked like the kind of thing you get on a fence, you know? Bent iron. I thought maybe they'd used a metal brace to reinforce the wood. What with her being, you know." Purbright waited. Rather solid in life was Mrs. Polliver, not unkindly meant. "No," said Purbright, "it rarely is in Flaxborough." He considered for a moment, then turned. "Come along, Mr. Winstanley. I think we might call on Mr. Codd." Codd and Strang's establishment was situated on Pilch Lane, a narrow thoroughfare favoured by pigeons, amateur botanists, and men who needed somewhere discreet to tie their shoes. The building was sedate, Georgian, with netted windows and a door that discouraged sudden entries. A polished brass plaque proclaimed, "Codd and Strang, Funeral Directors. Establishment 1892. Compassion with dignity." Inside, it smelled faintly of carnations and boiled wool. A young woman of non-committal age and extremely polite expression greeted them. "Mr. Codd," asked Purbright, "do you have an appointment?" "No," said Purbright, "but we do have a grave concern." Whether she caught the irony was unclear. She disappeared into a corridor and after some moments returned with Mr. Codd himself, tall, painfully upright, with the expression of a man who had long ago stopped attempting humour for fear it might appear unseemly. "Inspector," said Cod, clasping hands gently before him, "do come in." They were shown into a room best described as tactful. Mahogany furniture, leaflets arranged in severity, and a tea tray that appeared to have been poured, untouched, in perpetuity. The kind of room where no one ever laughed, even by accident. "I understand this concerns the late Mrs. Polliver?" Cod inquired once they were seated. "Only incidentally," said Purbright. "It's the late Mrs. Polliver's coffin that has raised eyebrows, or rather failed to lower completely. The lid resisted closing, I understand." Cod winced with the dignity of a man accepting a complaint about the Archbishop's handwriting. A slight irregularity, corrected on sight with discretion and without delay. "I'm sure. But Mr. Winstanley here, who dug the grave, reports that there was also something sharp. Metal, he believes, protruding from the coffin lining, and a sound. Whisper-like." Cod blinked. "Indeed, I see." The pause that followed was long enough for the teacups to develop a sheen. "I can assure you," Cod said at last, "our caskets are constructed to the highest—" "I'm not concerned with quality control," said Purbright mildly. "I'm more interested in whether anything was placed in the coffin besides Mrs. Polliver. There was a very faint noise, like a toe shifting on carpet." "I see," said Cod again, this time more slowly. "It is, of course, customary for certain mementos to be included. Letters, favourite trinkets, once a lemon tart. None of which require iron bracing," murmured Purbright. "You yourself handled the coffin." "I supervised. The preparation was done by young Mr. Strang." "May we speak with him?" "I'm afraid he's at lunch." Purbright smiled gently. "A long one?" "Since yesterday. He left town to visit his aunt." In Macclesfield, Purbright looked at Winstanley, who looked at the carpet. "I do hope she's well," Purbright said at last. "I believe she has arthritis." "A common affliction." "Yes." The conversation had clearly arrived at one of Flaxborough's customary impasses, where a question might be answered, but at a cost considered excessive to civility. Purbright stood. "You wouldn't mind if I examined the record for Mrs. Polliver's burial, would you? The inventory, perhaps?" Cod hesitated. "We do not generally." "Of course," Purbright said, still smiling. "But you will this time." Back in his office, Purbright reviewed the inventory, which listed 1 wool shawl, blue, 1 hymn book, Wesleyan, 1 tin of barley sweets, opened, 1 letter, sealed, addressed to Miss Hilda Polliver, 1 hand mirror, cracked, nothing metallic, nothing sharp, nothing remotely whispery. He placed a call to Miss Hilda Polliver. She answered in a voice so brittle it could have served with dessert. "Yes, I requested the letter go in. I didn't want it read. It was private, between my mother and myself." "Of course. Did anyone else handle the arrangements?" "Just the Undertakers. Mr. Strang, I think. He was very polite, young, a bit sweaty." "Did your mother have any enemies, Miss Polliver?" "Enemies?" "Inspector, she was on the pie committee." "Quite." He thanked her and rang off. Alone now, he considered the cracked mirror, a curious inclusion. Most families preferred things that symbolized fondness or piety. A cracked mirror suggested vanity, or perhaps a failure to escape it. He took out his notebook and added another line. Cracked mirror, deliberate symbolism. Letter, sealed. Sharp object unaccounted for. Outside, the street lamp flickered prematurely. Rain was threatening again. Purbright looked toward the window for a long time as though expecting the answer to drift down with the drizzle. Something had been put in that coffin that did not belong, and someone had made sure it would not rest quietly. He rose, stretched, and walked to the cabinet where tea and contemplation shared equal billing. As he poured, the phone rang once, twice, then stopped. When he returned to his desk, a fresh message had been left at reception. Man at the vicarage heard voices coming from the cemetery. Not the usual sort. Wants to speak. Purbright took a slow sip. So then, it wasn't over. The man who had left the message at the police station was not, strictly speaking, a man of the cloth, though his proximity to one lent him a borrowed air of piety. Mr. Leonidas Pettigrew lived in the east wing of the vicarage, a part once reserved for curates, now allocated to persons of slender means and ecclesiastical sympathy. He described himself, when pressed, as a theological illustrator, though no one in Flaxborough had ever seen his work in a bookshop, or indeed in a book. His room overlooked the cemetery, and his ears, he believed, had a particular sensitivity to spiritual frequencies. Inspector Purbright found him in the vicarage parlour, drinking a cordial of dark origin and humming what sounded like an incomplete hymn. He rose upon the inspector's entry, affecting the sort of frail grace one finds in old violins or unsuccessful poets. "Inspector," said Pettigrew, "I'm most obliged you've come." "You said you heard something," Purbright replied, not unkindly, and took a seat on a footstool upholstered in what appeared to be tweed. Pettigrew nodded gravely. "Voices. Last night. Very late, or very early, depending on your theological stance." "From the cemetery?" "Indeed. The Polliver section, I should think. You can't mistake the newly turned earth. The voices were low, male, urgent. Not, I think, spiritual. Not the sort to float." Purbright waited. "One of them, Inspector, said, 'We'll come back when it's quieter.' And the other said something I couldn't quite catch, except the last word was mirror." That word, mirror, had begun to take on the quality of a pebble in a shoe, irritating not for its size, but its persistence. Purbright leaned forward a little. "You're sure about the timing?" "I am. My clock had just struck 3:30. "Not 2. No. I make a habit of marking such things. I am, you see, recording certain nocturnal rhythms in connection with the Book of Hours." Purbright didn't press for detail. "Did you see anyone?" "Number. But I did hear footsteps shortly after. Not hurrying, but deliberate. Gravel was disturbed. Could it have been the groundskeeper? Mr. Winstanley? Unlikely. He walks with a more forgiving gait. These steps were purposeful and lighter." Purbright rose. "Thank you, Mr. Pettigrew. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, I'll write it down." Pettigrew nodded. "In Latin, if need be." The cemetery, just 2 minutes' walk from the vicarage, looked entirely untroubled by the night's reported commotion. Sparrows issued flippant remarks from the hedges. A paper coffee cup from the kiosk near the bus station lay in the grass near the entrance, suggesting that some nocturnal visitor had been modern in their vices. Purbright stepped lightly along the path, eyes scanning for irregularities. At the Polliver plot, the earth remained undisturbed, though now he noticed there was a slight compression along one edge, a flattening as though someone had stood very still for some time. A quiet scuff behind him made him turn. "Ah, Mr. Purbright," said Miss Teakle, the florist. She was a woman of firm bun and firmer opinion, who decorated the dead with the same brisk confidence she used to price carnations. "I do hope I'm not intruding. Only I noticed you walking past my van, and I did think, well, with all this talk of grave whispering. You've heard about it?" "Oh, good heavens, yes. That sort of thing doesn't stay buried long, does it? Ivy Drabble says it's the vicar rehearsing a one-man play. Personally, I suspect it's local children. They like to dare one another into nonsense after dark. Do they often succeed?" "They often try, Inspector, though not many make it past the first whisper of a pigeon. That graveyard gets very cold at night, spiritually and otherwise." She held out a small bunch of delphiniums. "These were for Mrs. Polliver, but her niece hasn't been by and they'll wilt by tea. You may as well give her the benefit." Purbright accepted the flowers and placed them gently at the grave. Miss Teakle lingered. "There was something strange about her coffin, you know," she said, half in confidence. "I'm no expert, but when I delivered the wreaths, I caught a glimpse of the inner lid. Looked scratched from the inside. I thought perhaps she'd had an unfortunate moment before the doctor arrived. Heart attacks can be tricky that way, but the scratches didn't look like they came from fingers." Purbright turned to her, his gaze suddenly sharper. "They looked like gouges," she said. "Horizontal, rough, not fingernails, more like, well, a blade." "And you didn't mention this earlier?" She straightened. "One doesn't wish to stir unnecessary unpleasantness." "No," said Purbright. "One rarely does." Back at the station, Sergeant Love, in the process of alphabetizing the local complaints ledger, looked up as Purbright entered. "I found something odd in the records," the inspector said, laying down his notebook. "About the mirror." Love blinked. "Mirror, sir. In the coffin. It was cracked. According to the Undertakers list, it belonged to Mrs. Polliver. But according to Miss Polliver, her mother hated mirrors. Never had one in the house larger than a compact, and even that faced downwards in its drawer." Love scratched his chin. "So whose mirror was it?" "A good question." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Purbright said, "Send Constable Henley to look into Miss Polliver's household. With her permission, of course. Ask about the contents of the house, specifically whether anything has gone missing in the last week, and find out if the niece Hilda had any recent visitors." "And the letter?" Love asked. "Still sealed, but I suspect that won't last." Indeed, later that evening, Miss Polliver rang. Her voice was tight, but not tearful. "Inspector, I felt I ought to tell you, though it's most irregular. I opened the letter." "Go on." "It wasn't from Mother. It was to someone else. From a man. It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. Horace Slagmore Purbright felt something settle into place." "The solicitor?" "He was a solicitor, retired years ago. But he was friendly with Mother. Too friendly, some said. After Father died, they had walks. Walks. On Wednesdays. Always Wednesdays. She'd wear her better shoes." "What did the letter say?" There was a pause. "It asked her to return something. It said, 'The thing in the frame, Edna. I know you kept it. You said you would destroy it, but I don't believe you. It's not safe. You must return it. You promised.' And this letter was placed with her." "Yes," Purbright exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Miss Polliver. That's most helpful." He sat for a long while after the call ended. A letter, unsigned. A mirror, not hers. Gouges in the coffin lid. Noises in the night. And a man who had made a promise. And perhaps come to collect on it. But why now? He stood and walked to the window. The street lamps had begun to buzz, one flickering uncertainly. A drizzle traced slow shapes on the pane. Tomorrow he would speak with Horace Slagmore and see if the dead had indeed taken anything with them worth digging up. Horace Slagmore lived in a detached red brick house on the far end of Mill Lane, past the cricket ground and just beyond the bus depot, where the timetables changed with a shrug and the air smelled faintly of brake fluid and jam sponge. His house was tall, oddly narrow, and carried the smug bearing of a property that had never once required scaffolding. Ivy curled at the eaves like a tidy moustache, and a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head announced the doorbell's redundancy. Inspector Purbright arrived just after 11, under a sky the colour of diluted porridge. He paused at the garden gate, noting the chrysanthemums planted in too orderly a row and a small iron bench that appeared entirely unused, except perhaps by cats or unread newspapers. There was no doorbell. He used the knocker once, then again. The second summons produced the sound of shuffling footsteps, the kind that hesitated before committing to being heard. The door opened just enough to reveal Mr. Slagmore, whose spectacles magnified his eyes into pale, startled saucers. His suit, once black, was now best described as ecclesiastical grey. His tie bore a pattern that had either faded or never quite existed. "Yes," he said, with the unmistakable tone of a man who already regretted answering. "Inspector Purbright," said the inspector gently. "I'd like a few minutes, if I may. I've not broken any bylaws." "That's a good start," Purbright replied, and waited. Slagmore stood still for a second longer, then opened the door wider, stepping back as if doing so only under legal obligation. He led the way to a drawing-room that looked as though it had once been dressed for a funeral and never changed since. Heavy curtains softened the light. The air was dry with books and mothballs. On a sideboard sat a photograph of a woman in Edwardian dress next to a tarnished ashtray filled with peppermints. "I'm not in the habit of offering tea before lunch," Slagmore said, settling into a cracked leather armchair. "That's quite all right," Purbright said, taking the opposite chair, which felt as if it disapproved of visitors. "I assume," Slagmore began, adjusting his cuff, "this has to do with Mrs. Polliver." "Indeed. You were acquainted with her?" Slagmore gave a prim sniff. "Insofar as any man could be said to be acquainted with a woman who guarded her affections like a bank vault. We walked, occasionally, mostly in silence. She appreciated restraint." "Some people do," said Purbright mildly. "I understand you wrote her a letter, one that was found after her death." Slagmore shifted. "She never replied to it." "That's not the part I find interesting. What concerns me is what the letter refers to, the thing in the frame." There was a pause, subtle and tight, as if the air itself had flinched. Slagmore looked away, toward the curtained window. "I didn't expect it to surface again, not after all this time. But it has." "Has it?" Slagmore glanced back quickly. "Someone went into her coffin," Purbright said softly, "after burial, or tried to, and they may have been looking for that very object." Slagmore's lips pinched together. "I never saw it myself, only heard of it. Edna said it was a safeguard, a kind of insurance. She kept it after her husband's accident. That was never formally discussed, you understand, only whispered about at council teas. But there were rumors of misconduct, local government funds diverted, something involving the railway boundary. Her husband fell, or jumped, onto the tracks before anything could be substantiated, and afterward she claimed to have found something in his desk drawer. A mirror. "Number A photograph," she said. "Or perhaps a sketch. It wasn't clear. But it showed something. She claimed it would implicate someone on the borough planning committee. Someone still living, I presume. She called it the trap door in the wallpaper. Whatever that meant." Purbright frowned. "And she kept it all these years?" "She said she'd destroyed it. That was in '74, but when she took ill last month, she wrote and asked whether I would do something important." "No detail, just that. I assumed it referred to the object, so I wrote back and begged her to let it go, to burn it, not to bring it down with her." "Evidently," he said with a dry bitterness, "she preferred melodrama. Do you know who else might have known about this material?" "Number. But if someone else did, and they believed it had been buried with her, they might dig for it," Purbright finished. Slagmore folded his hands on his lap. "Do you believe it's still in the coffin?" "I believe," Purbright said, rising, "that we ought to be certain." That afternoon, with the blessing of a reluctant but ultimately cooperative Miss Polliver, and under discreet supervision from Sergeant Love and a council clerk, whose expression suggested a long career in pretending not to see things, the coffin was exhumed. The process was unceremonious and mercifully swift. The casket, when opened, was as before, save for one absence. The hand mirror was gone. No sign of the cushion placed to prop the lid. No trace of the object in question, but the lining bore definite nude damage. Ragged tears along the side panel where something had been worked free with less than professional grace. Scratches on the wood. A faint smear, possibly from gloves. The letter, notably, had not been touched. "What do you make of it?" Love asked, gently closing the lid once more. "2 visitors," Purbright murmured. "At least. One the night before last, heard by Mr. Pettigrew, but perhaps the other earlier still, when Winstanley heard whispering. It's possible that that was the retrieval, and what Mr. Pettigrew heard was someone arriving too late." The coffin was reinterred with formal quiet, and a new bouquet from Miss Teakle, this time lilac hyacinths. By evening, Purbright found himself back in his office, hands loosely steepled over a thin file of notes. There were names jotted in the margins, committee members, councillors, former mayors, all connected to the years around Mr. Polliver's untimely demise. Several still resided locally. One he noticed was especially active in the current Historical Society, a group curiously obsessed with preserving the railway's defunct eastern spur. A knock broke his reverie. It was Constable Henley, a young man who gave the impression he'd been waiting for just the right moment to be useful. "Sir, we've just had a call from a Mrs. Pedder up on Sycamore Crescent. She says her garage was broken into last night." "Anything taken?" "Number nothing missing exactly. But there was something left behind. A cracked mirror, wrapped in a funeral shroud." Purbright stood. "Did she touch it?" "Said she didn't dare." "Good," said the inspector. "Let's go before she changes her mind." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air held its damp like a held breath. Somewhere in Flaxborough, someone had recovered the object they feared most, only to find it far too dangerous to keep. And someone else, perhaps, still wanted to know what it showed. Mrs. Pedder met them on the front step in her curlers and a housecoat that had once been peach, but now resembled something kept too long in a tea tin. She clutched a biscuit tin lid in one hand, like a small shield, and motioned them around the side of the house with the urgency of someone trying to keep secrets from a net curtain. "It's in the garage," she said, leading them down a narrow gravel path. "I haven't touched it. Not properly, and just had a look. Thought it might be dangerous, or cursed. You do hear things." "I shall assume the latter only if it begins to hover," Purbright murmured, half to himself. Sergeant Love gave a gentle cough. The garage was unlocked, but the door creaked with theatrical reluctance. Inside, past a half-dismantled chaise lounge and 3 folding chairs, still bearing the price tags from a 1971 jumble sale, sat the item in question. It had been placed neatly atop an upturned wooden crate, wrapped in what could only be described as a length of dark velvet embroidered with faded funereal lilies. The mirror's silver frame was ornate, slightly foxed, and cracked through the center with a jagged split that distorted any reflection into something faintly anatomical. Purbright approached without speaking, his hands behind his back. He observed the mirror from a slight angle, just enough not to see himself entirely. "This isn't a household object," he said quietly. "No," agreed Love, bending beside him. "And that cloth. It's not just velvet. That's shroud material, isn't it?" "It is." The inspector turned slightly. "Mrs. Pedder, may I ask how this came to be in your garage?" The woman shifted uncomfortably. "That's the thing, Inspector. I don't rightly know. I came out this morning to find the back gate swinging open and that thing just sitting there like it was waiting to be claimed. I thought maybe one of the local youths was playing a joke, but none of them would be caught dead with something so embroidered." Purbright nodded. "Do you know Mrs. Edna Polliver?" "Oh, I knew of her," Mrs. Pedder sniffed. "She once reported me to the parish council for painting my dustbin lid lilac. Said it caused visual unrest." "And had she ever been to your house?" "Never. We weren't of a compatible temperament. Yet someone chose this as the hiding place. He turned to Love. Take it in, carefully. Bag the cloth separately, and have the mirror photographed before we breathe on it too hard. Something about this feels delicate. Back at the station, the mirror was deposited in the evidence room with a caution usually reserved for explosives or very old cheese. It was photographed in detail, under several lighting conditions, and finally left covered, draped like a sleeping guest. Purbright examined the images carefully, each print revealing more of the curious fine etching on the frame. Tiny engravings, possibly letters, mostly worn away. Love returned from his call to the Historical Society with a small sheet of notepaper. Sir, I had them look into the railway planning archives from 1965 through 72. Seems there was a scheme, brief but costly, to reroute the eastbound spur to allow for a bypass. Never happened. Got blocked in committee. Anything unusual about the objections? That's where it gets interesting. The strongest objection came from Councillor Lenton Margrave. Purbright's eyebrow lifted a fraction. Margrave, he repeated. I thought he retired years ago. He did. Lives on the edge of town now. Bit of a recluse, but back then he chaired the planning subcommittee. And according to the records, he was the one who claimed to have received anonymous documentation warning of misuse of funds. So he blew the whistle. That's how it reads. Convenient, Purbright said, if he was already knee-deep in it himself. You think he was covering tracks? I think, Purbright replied, that the thing in the mirror, whatever it depicted, may have been the only surviving evidence, and whoever found it first wanted it hidden, or perhaps thought it too dangerous to destroy. Love hesitated. Then why leave it in a garage? Because they were being followed. The next morning, Purbright stood at the end of a gravel drive in a part of town that had once aspired to semi-rural dignity, but now mostly smelled of oil-fired heating. The house was a low-slung, pebble-dashed affair with a satellite dish angled defiantly toward France. He knocked twice. The man who answered was tall, skeletal, and blinked with the surprise of one who hasn't encountered daylight unfiltered in some time. His cardigan bore the markings of long-term siege, and his slippers were of the sort issued only to those who've stopped caring what month it is. Councillor Margrave? Purbright asked politely. The man blinked again. Was. Not since 77. May I come in? Margrave's living room smelled faintly of linseed oil and paperbacks. Several dozen books lay open in various poses across armrests and floor tiles, like casualties of a philosophical debate. A framed aerial photograph of Flaxborough from the late 60s hung above the hearth. The railway line, long since defunct, curved gently in the background like a regret. I'm here about Mrs. Polliver, Purbright began. Margrave's hand twitched toward his lapel, then settled. She's dead. Yes. She always said she'd outlive us all. Used to claim spite lengthened her days. Did she ever mention keeping any materials from your committee days? Margrave didn't answer immediately. Then, she said she had something. Once. But I assumed she was bluffing. Her husband, well, he wasn't careful. We all had our fingers in different pies back then. It wasn't corruption, it was improvisation. Was there an image? There was talk of one, Margrave admitted. Something showing a signature on a document that never reached the minutes. Could have been faked, but Edna was clever. Too clever. When her husband died, she stopped talking and started keeping things. I didn't want to know what. Would you have wanted it destroyed? Margrave looked at him, and something subtle flickered in the corners of his expression. Shame, perhaps, or just relief that the burden might be shared. I would have paid for it to disappear, but I didn't. Did you follow her burial? No. Did you go looking for the mirror? I didn't know it was real until you mentioned it just now. Purbright stood. Someone did. Someone with just enough knowledge to be frightened. If it isn't you, Councillor, then we'll need to find out who else it could be. As he left, he passed the aerial photograph again. This time his eyes lingered. A small outbuilding, no longer present in today's landscape, stood adjacent to the rail spur. He made a note. Back at the station, Love met him with a thin smile. Fingerprint analysis came through. From the mirror's frame, Purbright waited. Match found, on file. Belongs to Martin Codd. The Undertaker's son, Purbright said softly. Who, according to Mr. Codd Sr., is in Macclesfield visiting an arthritic aunt. He hasn't left town, Love said. His car's been spotted twice in the last day, once near the cemetery, once on Sycamore Crescent. Purbright nodded as though he'd just been handed the penultimate piece of a puzzle. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, simply, "Let's bring him in." Martin Codd was not brought in with force. That would have been out of keeping with both the tone of the investigation and the general temperament of Flaxborough. He was simply invited, telephoned by Sergeant Love in a voice of such polite neutrality it might have been mistaken for a dinner reservation. Mr. Codd, for his part, arrived with a freshly ironed shirt and an expression somewhere between mild irritation and cautious reverence, like a man expecting to be asked to judge a jam competition and suspecting foul play. He was shown into Interview Room 1, which had, until recently, served as a minor archive. A faint smell of damp foolscap still lingered. Inspector Purbright sat opposite, hands folded neatly on a folder whose contents he made no effort to disguise or reveal. The room was silent for several seconds before either spoke. "Mr. Codd," Purbright said at last, "thank you for coming in." Martin offered a nod. "I'm assuming this is about Mrs. Polliver's funeral. Her niece already sent a letter of thanks. She was uncharacteristically kind. I'm not here to discuss your handling of the funeral arrangements, though they were, by all accounts, conducted with typical efficiency. I'm more concerned about what happened after the funeral." Martin shifted. His hands moved to the arms of the chair, where his fingers began gently tapping, as if practicing for an invisible keyboard recital. "I'm not sure I follow." "A mirror," said Purbright, "wrapped in velvet. Missing from the coffin after burial. Found in a garage on Sycamore Crescent. It had your fingerprints on it." Martin stopped tapping. "I wore gloves," he said quietly. "Gloves leave fewer fingerprints," Purbright agreed. "But not none. Not if they're poor quality. Not if they're removed for a moment. Say, to wipe something clean." Martin said nothing. "I believe," the inspector continued, "that you knew something was placed into that coffin. Not by the family, not by the Undertakers officially. Something slipped in privately. A mirror, cracked, etched, and dangerous in its way. Not because it could cut, but because of what it revealed. You saw it, you touched it, and then you tried to remove it." "It wasn't mine," Martin said finally. "I didn't put it there, but I saw it before the lid was sealed. It was resting by her feet, tucked behind the hymnal. I thought it was decorative at first, but then I saw the frame." "What about it?" "It wasn't polished. It had these little lines carved into it, like Latin letters or old runes. You could barely see them unless you looked close. And the glass, it didn't just show your face. It showed something else." Purbright's tone didn't change. "What did it show, Mr. Codd?" Martin looked down. A building, old. But not from here. Not Flaxborough. It was too steep, the rooftops. Like somewhere northern. I don't know how it works, Inspector. I'm not mad. But when I looked into it, the reflection didn't follow me. It just stayed the same, like it was frozen in someone else's moment. He rubbed his forehead. "I should have told someone, but I thought it might be valuable, not just financially. Historically, I didn't want it buried. So after the service, I waited." "At the cemetery?" "No, across the road, in the council van depot. You can see the south wall from there. After the mourners left, I slipped back. I had a spare key to the groundskeeper's hut. I used that to unlock the tool gate. I didn't dig, just unlatched the coffin lid enough to reach in. But the mirror was gone, said Purbright calmly. Martin blinked. Number it was there. I took it. The inspector tilted his head, just slightly. Martin hesitated. Wait, are you saying that someone returned it later, wrapped it in shroud cloth, left it in a garage, on a street you were seen there, Mr. Codd? So if you had the mirror, someone else took it back. I swear I left it at home. I panicked, yes. I didn't want it found in the mortuary van, so I brought it home, hid it in the attic. But the next morning it was gone. And did you tell your father? Martin hesitated. He would have called the constables or the council board. He's still very traditional. Indeed, said Purbright, and yet he told us you were visiting an aunt in Macclesfield. Martin flushed. That was his idea. I said I was taking a few days. He filled in the details. What were you really doing? Looking for whoever took it. I thought someone else must have known that I'd been followed, and then when I heard about the voices in the cemetery, I thought maybe someone was trying to put it back. Maybe they didn't want to keep it either, because of what it shows. Martin nodded. There's something wrong with that mirror, Inspector. You don't look into it, not really. It looks into you. I didn't believe in that sort of talk. Not before. But that night after I took it, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw rooftops. The same ones. Cold, black slate. Like it was trying to tell me something, or pull me somewhere. There was a silence between them. The air in the small room seemed thinner than it had before. Purbright reached forward and opened the folder before him. This is a photograph taken of the mirror you say you removed from the coffin. Martin leaned in. The image was clear, sharply lit by the station's overhead lamps. He blinked. That's not it. No. No, he said again, louder. That's not the one I took. The carving's different, and the crack. Mine had a long vertical split. This one's jagged off to the side. Someone switched it. Purbright closed the folder. That, he said softly, would suggest there are two. Martin sat back hard, as though the chair had betrayed him. But then, why leave one at all? He whispered. If someone had it, why give it back? Purbright didn't answer immediately. He let the question settle in the space between them. Then, because someone else is looking for the original. And they want us to believe we've already found it. Martin looked up. You think this is a misdirection? I think, said Purbright, rising, that someone buried a false trail and that the real mirror, whatever it contains, is still out there. He left Martin in the care of Sergeant Love and stepped into the corridor, the chill of a late afternoon already creeping under the window frames. In his office, he took out the aerial photograph of the old Flaxborough rail spur and examined it again. The outbuilding, long gone, had stood precisely where the old maintenance line bent inland, toward the waterworks. He underlined it once. If there were two mirrors, someone had a reason to keep one and bury the other, not to protect others, but to protect themselves. And whoever had made that decision had been watching long before Edna Polliver died. Purbright poured himself a half-cup of tea. It had gone cold, but he didn't notice. They were no longer merely dealing with the remains of old scandals. They were dealing with something alive, still moving, still watching, and perhaps still waiting. The photograph of the disused maintenance shed remained on Purbright's desk long after the tea had gone the way of most station tea, lukewarm, overstewed, and capable of reanimating the dead only in metaphor. He stared at the faded image, not in search of architectural detail, but in the manner of a man waiting for a memory to rise uninvited. The building had been gone for over a decade, raised after a committee reshuffle, quietly and without much paperwork. Nothing in Flaxborough ever disappeared entirely, but the council had a curious talent for losing things that once stood in plain sight. Purbright took his coat from the stand by the door and left without announcement. Sergeant Love, catching the movement from the corner of his eye, stood halfway from his desk. "Shall I come with you, sir?" Purbright paused in the doorway. "Not yet. If I'm not back in an hour, follow the direction of regret." He stepped out into the chill of late afternoon, the sky turning that peculiar English grey that suggested rain without the commitment. His shoes struck damp leaves as he walked, first through the quiet streets of Flaxborough, then toward the station's old eastern fringe, where railway history had given way to tangled hedgerows and tin sheds that hummed with the vague menace of forgotten tools. The maintenance path was half-choked with weeds, but still navigable. It sloped slightly downward toward where the spur had once curved between the waterworks fence and the old gas substation. The ground bore no obvious signs of the outbuilding now, just a patch of flattened nettles and a few sunken brick outlines hinting at a foundation. But Purbright walked slowly, as if the past still rustled faintly underfoot. He stopped at what must once have been the entrance, an indentation in the earth where the grass refused to grow and where something, recently, had disturbed the moss. He crouched and saw it, a torn fragment of cloth, dark velvet, snagged on a splinter of concrete, the same velvet that had wrapped the mirror. He did not pocket it. He simply stared for some time, letting the quiet fill in details that facts could not. Someone had been here, and recently, someone carrying something. Behind him, gravel shifted. A step. Not an animal. Not the wind. Purbright straightened calmly and turned. A figure stood at the edge of the path, framed against the thicket. Not close, not moving. "Councillor Margrave," Purbright said, without raising his voice. The man didn't speak. He wore the same threadbare coat from their last meeting, but it now hung open, flapping slightly as though it resented the wind. In his hand, held like a parcel, was something wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. "You've been here before," Purbright said. Still nothing, but the fingers twitched against the package. "You are part of it. Not just the cover-up, but the object itself. Whatever that mirror shows, it isn't just evidence. It's something you feared. Maybe even created." Margrave's lips parted just slightly, the corners trembling with age or something else. He took a step forward. Purbright held his ground. "What's in the parcel, Councillor?" "I thought it was destroyed," Margrave said, voice dry as unbuttered toast. "She told me she'd smashed it. In '74, that's what she said. She wanted leverage, but not legacy. I believed her. And yet here we are. I saw it once. Just once." His eyes drifted, not toward Purbright, but somewhere behind him. "It doesn't show you what you've done. It shows what you meant to do before you changed your mind. It shows the intention, the original sin. And yours. A man in uniform, holding papers, laughing." Margrave's voice cracked. "It wasn't me. But it could have been. Would have been if I hadn't turned on them. And you've been trying to keep that future dead ever since." Margrave took another step. "It's not just a mirror, Inspector. It's a promise. A cursed one. Edna wanted it buried. She buried the wrong one." He unwrapped the parcel. Slowly. Inside, resting against the folds of coarse paper, was a second mirror. Smaller, older. Its silver was tarnished into shadow, the glass cracked diagonally like a wound across a face. The frame bore no engraving, only the faint outline of a handprint, as though someone had pressed against it from the inside. Purbright exhaled. "You've had it all along." Margrave nodded, and for a moment his expression was no longer defensive, but almost relieved. "I thought I could pass it off. Let someone else carry the weight, but that boy, the Undertaker's son, he took the decoy. Good lad, but clumsy. He didn't know. I hoped the story would end there, but it keeps calling people back. You, him, Edna, me." "What do you want to do with it now?" Purbright asked. Margrave's eyes narrowed. "Finish What should have been done years ago. Smash it, scatter the pieces. Purbright regarded the man in silence. Then, in a voice so low it barely touched the air, he said, "It won't break." Margrave stiffened. "How do you know?" "Because if it could have, Edna would have done it. So would you. But it survives. Someone made sure of that." A gust of wind passed through the clearing then, lifting the paper edges and making the mirror catch a sliver of grey light. Purbright stepped forward. "We have to contain it. Lock it away. No more theatrics. No more rituals. And no more garage doors left open for chance." Margrave looked down at the mirror, as if seeing it for the first time. Then, quietly, he handed it over. Back at the station, under tight supervision, Purbright had the object sealed, double-wrapped in archival cloth, placed in a reinforced evidence case, and locked in the vault beneath the Central Archive, a space once used to store wartime ration ledgers and flood maps. He filed no report on its contents, only a brief, deliberately dull line in the register. Personal item held pending civil dispute. By the time dusk bled into evening, Flaxborough had resumed its usual murmur. Outside the town hall, the lamplighter lit the final posts by hand, a task he pretended was mechanical, but performed with the reverence of old craft. Sergeant Love tapped gently at Purbright's office door. "Margrave's gone home, sir. Says he's taking a holiday, somewhere without reflections." "Good," said Purbright. "And the boy, Martin Codd?" "He'll be fine," the inspector said. "He made a poor decision, not a criminal one. He'll think twice next time before prying into the pockets of the dead." Love hesitated. "Sir, what if there are more? Other mirrors, other promises?" Purbright glanced toward the shuttered cabinet in the corner, then back to his sergeant. "Then we'll deal with them," he said. "Quietly. One by one. That's what Flaxborough does best." Love gave a thin smile and nodded. "Yes, sir." And as he left, the town exhaled once more, softly, as though another secret had been safely buried beneath a layer of polite silence. Inspector Purbright didn't sleep that night, though he made a half-hearted attempt at pretending. The warmth of his flat, the gentle tick of the hall clock, even the comfort of a well-thumbed railway almanac failed to settle the unease that had taken quiet residence just behind his eyes. It wasn't fear. Not quite. It was something older, like standing in a room where someone had just whispered your name without sound. At the station the next morning, the mood was subdued but composed. Sergeant Love was already at his desk, flipping through incident logs that mostly involved domestic disagreements about compost heaps and one alleged trespass by a ferret. "The mirror's secure," Love reported without being asked. "Double lock checked at 6 a.m. "Not a scratch on it," Purbright nodded. "And Margrave?" "Left on the 7:30 coach to Whitby. Took only one bag and a copy of moral geography. Well, he won't get far with that, either in distance or redemption." Love allowed himself a half-smile. "Codd came in earlier too. Wanted to thank you." Purbright blinked. "For what?" "For not charging him, I expect. He said he'd taken a job inventorying the church vestry silver. Claims he wants to handle things that stay put. An admirable ambition." Love paused. "Sir, do you believe what he said? About the mirror showing things that might have happened?" "I believe," said Purbright slowly, "that some objects are dangerous not because they lie, but because they whisper a version of the truth we're afraid to admit. People break over those kinds of truths." Love looked down. "There's something else." Of course there was. One of the council clerks, Miss Linney, came across an old request docket while reorganizing the archive shelves. It's unsigned, undated, mentions the mirror directly, refers to it as the draft. Said it was to be stored for safekeeping by the Ecclesiastical Liaison Office. There's no such office. "Let me guess," Purbright said, rubbing his temple. It was filed under miscellaneous spiritual materials. Love handed him the slip. It was yellowed and typed in a script that had gone out of style with carbon copies and civil courtesy. The language was vague, deliberately so. No names, no origins, just the repeated phrase, "Do not allow the image to recur." Purbright leaned back in his chair, holding the paper as one might hold a moth by the wings. Before he could speak, the station phone rang, shrill and unhurried, as if it too had been politely trained. Love picked it up, listened briefly, and passed the receiver to Purbright with the reverence usually reserved for freshly signed treaties. "It's Mr. Pettigrew, from the vicarage." Of course it was. Purbright took the call, nodded once or twice, and then said quite distinctly, "No. Don't touch it. We're on our way." He replaced the receiver with a click, reached for his coat, and looked at Love. Something's appeared on his wall. Love raised an eyebrow. "A crack?" "A drawing," said Purbright, "in the condensation above his sink. He says it's of a train." They walked the distance to the vicarage in silence, the early fog curling between hedges and footpaths like something living. Flaxborough wore mist comfortably, as if it had long since decided that clarity was a vulgar, modern invention. Mr. Pettigrew answered the door with his usual blend of ceremony and dread. "I do apologize," he said, leading them inside. "I wouldn't have called, but it's so precise. I haven't drawn anything in years, not since the incident with the Methodist calendar, and yet there it is." He ushered them into the small, tiled kitchen at the back of the house. The window was slick with morning condensation, and on it, drawn with a single, continuous finger line, was the unmistakable outline of a locomotive, old-fashioned, with a sloped boiler and lantern-stye front. Beneath it, faintly rendered, was a series of arches. A viaduct. Purbright studied it closely. The arches were uneven, the curve of the viaduct subtly warped, as if drawn from memory, or perhaps from a dream. "Did you make this?" he asked. Pettigrew shook his head. "I noticed it when I came down for tea. The window was clean last night. I always clean it. Hygiene is holiness." Purbright touched the window carefully. The steam fogged around his hand, but the drawing remained intact. No smearing, no streaks. The line was in the condensation, not atop it. Love stepped beside him. Could it be a child, local prank? "Children rarely draw locomotives from the 1860s, said Purbright, "unless possessed by a peculiar and worrying nostalgia." Pettigrew wrung his hands. "There's more, I'm afraid. I heard something just before dawn. A whistle, not like the kettle, lower, faint, like something trying not to disturb the air." Purbright glanced once more at the viaduct. Then he turned. "Mr. Pettigrew, do you have any railway maps in the house?" The man brightened. "Do I? I've got the entire 1894 Midlands Excursion Index. It doubles as a fireguard in winter." "Fetch it." 10 minutes later, the three of them stood in the parlour, the heavy map unfolded over the sideboard. Purbright ran his finger along the old lines, then stopped. "There," he said. "The viaduct at Breck Hollow. Demolished in 1973 after a land subsidence. Nothing remained now but a stretch of wild ground between two collapsed embankments. It had once carried the maintenance spur before the station decommissioned the eastern run." Purbright tapped it again. "That's where the mirror image came from." Pettigrew blinked. "You mean someone's remembering it? Or someone's returning to it?" That afternoon, Purbright and Love travelled to Breck Hollow. The area, now a gentle trough of grass and scattered stone, gave no indication of its former burden. Birds roosted in the hedgerow, and someone had left a broken lawn chair near a disused stile. But at the very centre of the hollow, where the old viaduct footings had once stood, the earth was churned recently. A shallow trench, as if someone had been searching for something beneath the soil and given up in frustration. Purbright crouched. In the trench was a shard of glass, curved, silvered on one side. He held it up. It reflected nothing at all. They were not finished. The second mirror had not been sealed. It had been broken and scattered. Someone thought this was the way to end it, he said. Love looked uneasy. Did they? Purbright turned the shard in his hand. In the glass, for just a moment, a faint figure moved, rail-bound, lantern swinging, forever late. No, said the inspector softly. They just made more pieces. By the time Purbright and Sergeant Love returned to the station, dusk was already thinning the colours out of Flaxborough. The sky had settled into a reluctant mauve, and the hedges along Station Road looked less like shrubs and more like polite onlookers. The inspector walked with the careful rhythm of a man balancing a teacup full of questions and no answers, yet safe to pour. In his coat pocket, the shard of mirror sat wrapped in a square of oilskin, taken from the back of Love's motorbike kit. The sliver hadn't cut him when he picked it up. It had felt warm, not hot, nothing dramatic, but as though it had just been held by someone else, someone who hadn't left footprints. Inside the station, Love locked the fragment away in the secondary vault. It didn't require the same precautions as the full mirror, or so they hoped. But even so, he placed it inside a case with no reflective surface, lined it with felt, and took care not to look at it longer than necessary. 2 mirrors, he said, shutting the door with a soft metallic finality. Or 1 mirror, broken. Either way, someone scattered the rest, probably more than just this one piece. And someone will want to find them, Purbright replied. He sat at his desk without removing his coat, stared at the blotter, then reached for the list of archived town incidents from the mid-70s, a brittle folder compiled by a long-retired constable known for excessive underlining and a suspicious mistrust of window cleaners. Purbright turned the pages slowly. A small section, yellowed and misfiled, caught his eye. Incident 4776A, he read aloud. Trespass, unlawful access to the maintenance spur at Breck Hollow. Vandalism to a disused signal box. Night entry. No suspect identified. Love leaned over. Date? 4 weeks after Edna Polliver's husband died. They sat in silence for a beat. You think it was her? Love asked. I think it was someone working for her, Purbright said. Someone who knew what she'd found in her husband's files. Someone who realized the mirror, or what it revealed, was too important to simply destroy. But she couldn't risk keeping it whole. He turned the page again, then paused. Here. Name. Willard Shreve. Council clerk, dismissed 1977. No pension awarded. Noted for erratic behavior. Several reports of unusual language. Unusual how? Purbright tapped the sheet. Spoke as though quoting someone who wasn't present. That's one entry. Another, refused to work in rooms with glass. Love frowned. Still living? Unclear. But I recall the name. Used to lodge behind the post office. Ground floor bedsit with green curtains and no doorbell. Love was already pulling the electoral roll from the cabinet. They found Shreve listed, just barely, under a property now marked as under tenancy dispute. Last confirmed address. The Brooms, 11 Redfern Close. Let's walk, Purbright said, standing. Redfern Close was a quiet lane tucked behind the municipal allotments, mostly bungalows and the occasional defiant clothesline. Number 11 had an air of long-term neglect that didn't reach into dereliction but certainly knocked on the door. The curtains were gone. The windows had been covered inside with cardboard. A small note had been wedged into the doorframe in blue chalk, no entry. Silver toxic. Love raised an eyebrow. Not a council notice? No, said Purbright. More personal? More frightened. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked, The air inside smelled faintly of damp paper and something older. Wax, perhaps, or wood that had tried too long to hold a memory. The front room was bare apart from a single wooden chair facing a wall. On the wall was a pinned photograph of the Breck Hollow Viaduct, taken just before demolition. It was cracked through the middle as though someone had folded it in anger, then changed their mind halfway through. Beside the chair, on the floor, was a box. Love crouched. Newspapers, old ones, mostly foreign. He pulled one out, a 1969 edition of Le Soir from Brussels. On the front page, a photo of a train station blurred in the background. Purbright examined it. They're all different, but every one of them includes a railway. In the corner, or reflected in a window, always peripheral. Love's fingers moved deeper into the box. He drew out a piece of thick paper, heavier than newsprint. "It's a sketch," he said. He turned it toward Purbright. The inspector took a breath. It was a mirror, not just any, but the mirror, rendered in precise graphite lines, every filigree captured. Around it were what looked like notes, scribbled in a jagged, shifting hand. One piece reveals the whole. Faces remembered backward. It watches when not watched. Purbright placed the sketch down. This isn't obsession, it's record-keeping. He was tracking them, not just mirrors, the echoes. Love straightened. What happened to him? Either he ran out of ways to keep the pieces apart, Purbright said, or someone helped him disappear. Someone who thought he'd gone too far. They searched the rest of the flat. No body, no letters, just a final object. A box of matchsticks with a single mirror shard glued to the inside lid. Purbright closed it carefully. He'd started trying to trap reflections, as if he thought they'd multiply. Or escape, Love muttered. That night, Purbright took the files home. He did not light a lamp. Instead, he sat by the window, the moon catching the edge of the glass just enough to turn it pearlescent. He did not look at his reflection. He watched the edges of the window instead. At some point after midnight, a sound rose from the street outside. Not footsteps, not wheels. A faint whistle, thin, distant. Just for a second, then gone. Purbright stood, crossed to the mirror in the hall, one of only two in his home, and covered it with a dust sheet. Then he returned to his chair. There were more pieces out there, some buried, some broken, and perhaps one still whole. Somewhere, someone knew how it worked, and if they were clever, they were already using it. In the brittle stillness of early morning, Inspector Purbright arrived at the station before the first kettle had begun its reluctant hiss. The sky was pale with cold and possibility. He unlocked the front door himself and moved through the echoing corridors like a man unwilling to disturb the furniture of his own thoughts. His reflection, briefly caught in the polished glass of the notice board, made him pause, but only for a second. He had, by now, taught himself to look slightly to the side of any surface capable of giving back more than it received. By the time Sergeant Love arrived with a parcel of toast and a thermos that could have been weaponized, Purbright was already bent over the old incident files again. "You're here early, sir." "I wasn't really elsewhere," Purbright said without looking up. Love poured 2 cups of tea with something approximating gentleness. "You believe Shreve was tracking the reflections?" "I do. He'd begun to chart not just the mirrors, but the impressions they left. Each piece broken, each surface compromised. It seems they held more than just images. They held intentions, echoes of what people almost did." Love frowned. "So they're not all the same?" "No," said Purbright. "Some reflect memory, others reflect fear. The original, if it still exists, reflects motive, or perhaps more dangerously, the possibility of motive. A fragment shows one corner of that. Multiply enough corners, and you start seeing rooms." There was a long pause as Love tried to decide whether he was reassured or not. "Sir, do you still think this is a police matter?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was without ceremony. "I think it's still happening within the bounds of our jurisdiction, and until the threat becomes either mythological or unprovable, we treat it like a crime. A quiet one, the sort no one puts in the newsletter." Love stirred his tea. "What if someone's collecting the fragments?" "Then they're further along than we are, but not, I suspect, invulnerable." An hour later, a telephone call came through from a caretaker at St. Olave's Grammar. A child had gone missing. Not for long, only a matter of 10 minutes, but when found, the girl had been curled beneath a stairwell, clutching something under her coat and whispering the same word again and again. Window. Purbright and Love were on the scene within 20 minutes. The girl, Elsie Moore, age 11, was seated in the staff lounge with a mug of milk and a dazed look that had nothing to do with sugar. The object she'd been found holding was a shard of mirror set into a crude wooden backing made from popsicle sticks. Not sharp, not fresh, but unmistakably part of the same design as the one discovered at Breck Hollow. Purbright knelt beside her. "Elsie, I'm going to ask you something, and it's important you tell the truth." She nodded slowly. "Where did you find that?" "In the cupboard," she said, voice barely above breath. "Behind the coats. Someone left it there." "Someone?" "A woman, I think. I didn't see her come in, but I heard shoes, the kind that don't squeak." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "What did the mirror show you?" Elsie blinked, and her lower lip trembled. "It showed me the science room, but the door was closed, and I wasn't in it, but I was. I was standing at the window looking out, and I could see myself through it like it was the wrong side of the day." She clutched her arms. "I didn't want to keep it, but I couldn't move. It wanted me to remember something I hadn't done yet." Purbright nodded gently. "You did very well, Elsie. You let it go. That's the important part." He took the shard with gloved hands and wrapped it in brown paper from the school stationery cupboard. As they left the building, Love muttered, "Someone's seeding them, sir. Dropping fragments in places where people are alone. Children, quiet corners, places where guilt hasn't hardened yet." "They're testing thresholds," Purbright replied, "seeing what gets through." They returned to the station where the vault now contained not one but 2 mirror fragments, both subtly different in size and engraving. No single pattern, no unified shape, as if the pieces themselves were intentionally mismatched, made not to reunite, but to proliferate. "I think," said Purbright slowly, "we've been wrong about one thing. The mirror Edna Polliver buried wasn't the last. It was the first, a reproduction, something meant to draw out others, like bait." Love turned. "Then who made the original?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he opened the archive index again, this time looking not for people, but for places. Shreve had charted his own obsession geographically. Viaducts, spurs, disused tunnels, empty council properties. He'd moved like someone circling a wound, narrowing in. "Sir," Love said softly, "this line, here." He pointed to one of Shreve's maps. "There's a convergence point. Right here, between the old gasworks and the canal." Purbright nodded. "The original maintenance shed, where the false mirror was first placed." He picked up his coat again, slower this time. "Let's go back. But this time, we're not looking for pieces." Red light crept across the clouds as they made their way back to the hollow. The earth had stiffened overnight. Frost clung to the grass like memory. Purbright moved without speaking, boots crunching softly. At the trench, he stopped. "It was buried here," he said. "Not the mirror." The mold Love blinked. "Mold?" "A casting pattern. For replication. Mirrors aren't just objects. They're made. And whoever started this, they didn't just leave one behind. They left the means to make more. He knelt again and scraped gently at the edge of the trench. Something clicked. Metal. He pulled up a small rectangular frame, rusted, hollow, with faint ridges where glass would sit, and etched into one side. 1/7. 7, he said aloud. There were 7 made. Love looked around slowly, the empty field now twice as large in implication. "Sir," he said, "how many do we have?" 2 in the vault. 1 missing, the decoy taken by Margrave. 1 in Shreve's flat, repurposed. 1 with the child. 5. 2 still unaccounted for. Purbright stood. The wind tugged at his coat as though warning him off. "We need to find them, Sergeant, before they find their way into someone else's hands." Love looked up. And what if someone's already holding one? Purbright turned his eyes toward the distant town, its steeples and chimneys softened by fog. "Then they'll start using it," he said quietly, "to rewrite what people could have done." And in a place like Flaxborough, where the past was never truly past, that was enough to unmake everything. They returned to Flaxborough, just as the street lamps were clicking on one by one, like hesitant witnesses deciding whether to speak. The town was unchanged, of course. That was the trouble with Flaxborough. Everything stayed precisely as it had been until you looked closely, and then you noticed something out of place. A door ajar that should have been shut, a figure in a window that didn't belong, the sound of a train in a town where the lines had long since gone quiet. Inside the station, the mood was subdued. The vault now held 3 mirror fragments, each labeled, wrapped, and separated in padded boxes. But it was the space between them that seemed to hum. Nothing overt, nothing that would trigger equipment or tests, but something felt by the skin rather than the brain. Purbright stood over the boxes and thought of clocks, of timing mechanisms, of traps not made to spring once, but again and again. 7 made, he said aloud. 5 accounted for. 1 likely destroyed. That leaves 1. Love nodded. And if it's in someone's hands, they've stayed quiet. No sightings. No disturbances. No public ones, Purbright corrected. But there's been a change. He walked to the pinboard where various dates, maps, and notes had accumulated in what passed for visual clarity. He pointed to the week following the first exhumation. Council reshuffle. Emergency meeting. The town's electrical grid briefly overloaded. No cause found. That same night, several residents near Redfern Close reported hearing voices. Low ones. Familiar. No one spoke to the neighbors about it. They each assumed it was a personal hallucination. Because it was, sir? No, Purbright said. Because it wasn't. The mirror doesn't reflect fantasy. It reflects possible guilt. Someone's using the last piece. Not just hiding it, activating it. Love crossed his arms, uneasily. For what purpose? Purbright was quiet for a long time. To bend history, he said at last. Not to change it outright, not yet. But to nudge. Plant memory where none existed. Create doubt. Make someone believe they almost did something they never considered. It's not mind control, it's narrative suggestion. A reshaping of what could have been, so convincingly it becomes what was. And in a place like Flaxborough, where the truth always wears a borrowed coat, it wouldn't take much. The sergeant's voice lowered. So who would benefit from that? Purbright walked to the cabinet and drew out a folder he had set aside days ago, labeled only Historical Society / Restricted Access. It contained minutes, meeting notices, and one curious transcript from a private gathering in 1976, recorded, surreptitiously it seemed, by a clerk named Shelley who had since emigrated to Canada. The transcript was fragmentary, handwritten, and poorly preserved, but one section was underlined 3 times. The mirror must not be destroyed, not while the project remains incomplete. It is the only proof of alternate resolve. Love squinted. Alternate resolve? Purbright closed the file. The idea that someone would have done the right thing, if only they'd been allowed, a weapon for reputation laundering. They looked at each other. Councillor Raxby, Love said. Of course, Purbright murmured. He chaired that very session, been silent lately, which in his case is the equivalent of shouting from a rooftop. Raxby was a fixture in Flaxborough politics. He existed like dry rot, unseen but slowly undermining structures once trusted. Always there in photographs, but never quite in focus. And if someone had the last mirror, someone clever enough to know what it could do and cruel enough to use it, it would be him. We'll need to visit him, Purbright said. Tonight. Quietly. Raxby's home sat at the edge of the town green, flanked by two hedges that leaned in conspiratorially. The curtains were drawn, but a pale amber glow seeped around the edges. Purbright didn't knock immediately. He listened. Inside, a gramophone. Chopin. Deliberate. Looping. He knocked once. After a pause, the door opened. Raxby stood there in a housecoat and cravat, an affectation he had never earned. His expression was calm, mildly surprised, as if he'd expected the law eventually, just not this evening. "Inspector," he said. "How civil." Purbright smiled thinly. "We'd like to ask you a few things. I imagine you would." They entered the front room. Books, decanters, a newspaper from last Thursday folded exactly in half. And on the far wall, an ornate mirror. Not cracked, not silvered. Whole. It was propped in a stand like a harp, half shrouded in muslin, but unmistakable. The frame bore no writing, but the curve was familiar. It hummed, faintly, in the chest more than the ears. "You've kept it very well," Purbright said. Raxby's smile didn't falter. It was never lost, just unremembered. "You've used it." "I've allowed it to speak," Raxby replied, "to show people their almost selves. It's remarkable what remorse can accomplish, when it's not real. You should try it sometime, Inspector, the moral clarity it affords." Purbright's tone stayed level. "How long?" "Since Edna's funeral. The decoy worked. Everyone looked there. No one looked back here. The mirror returned itself. They do, you know, when someone's ready to use them properly. You've caused a great deal of confusion." "I've removed confusion," Raxby said. "A councilman remembers almost reporting me. A rival editor imagines nearly publishing something slanderous. They doubt their own doubt. It's very efficient." "And the child?" Purbright asked softly. Raxby's gaze flickered. "That was not me. Someone else is playing, Inspector. I suspect Shreve left more behind than notes. Not everyone agrees the mirrors should be wielded. Some want them shattered. They're amateurs, clumsy." "You're under arrest," Purbright said. Raxby nodded once as if expecting it. "For what? Moral tampering? Guilt suggestion? You'll struggle to find a law for what might have happened." Purbright stepped forward. "Noted. But for now, possession of restricted civic property, theft from the council archive, interference in municipal records." "Ah," Raxby sighed. "The boring ones." Love moved behind him as Purbright approached the mirror. He reached to cover it, but paused. In the glass, he saw Raxby standing calmly, but in the mirror's depth, far behind him, another figure flickered. Tall, thin, silent, watching. Purbright let the cloth fall. Raxby was led out without resistance. Back at the station, the mirror was locked in the main vault. No light, no air, surrounded by nothing that could reflect. Purbright stood alone in the evidence room, watching the dark cloth rise and fall just slightly as if exhaling. He didn't speak. He didn't look in. He simply turned off the lights and walked out. The mirror would wait. Others might come. The story would not end. But Flaxborough would go on, unchanged, unremembered, and never quite innocent.